going up for tenure, and we were looking for other things to build their packet. And as you do your traditional citation counts and those types of things, I started seeing, well, within the legal field, people weren't really doing other metrics. So I started looking to some of the other disciplines, and that's when I started looking at what the scientists were doing. And they're doing a lot of really cool stuff. So this is sort of going to talk about the science, what they're doing, and then where we need to be adding some of these things in to legal education, where we can use it to bolster our own CVs, and what we can do to help our faculty, especially some of our faculty that still call it that tweeting thing. So things that we can do to help them so they can be part of the conversation. Because the problem is for some of them, they're missing out on a lot of the experts participating in the conversation. So we need to get them there, either by providing the instruction to them or by actually doing it for them and then giving them some recommendations. The other thing that I want to do is I want to plug a program that I attended yesterday afternoon. So Paul Karen actually did a really great program where he talked about baseball and blogging and looking at statistics. So I highly recommend when you go back and you can watch the tape, watch that one. It's a good one. All right, so let's begin. So the whole idea is basically that now, because of the internet, because of social media, we can actually start taking a look at seeing these conversations that are going on, and we can track it. So we can say, hey, this particular faculty member, this particular scientist, in the case of what this study was talking about, is involved in the conversation. They're participating. People are listening to them. Sometimes it's for good reasons, sometimes it's for bad reasons, but it's something that we can track. It's a metric. It's a tangible. It isn't just an anecdote that's out there. So here's my little teaser for those of you that are like, oh goodness, she's going to talk about theory and science, and I'm not sure if I'm really interested in all of that. So there's this one particular scientist that they highlighted in a Chronicle of Higher Ed article where his citation count for his article when he was going up for tenure for this one particular article that he was really proud of was 80. And he's like, okay, 80, that's pretty good. It's a decent number. I can add that to my tenure packet. And then he ends up getting a phone call from PLOS1, which is the Public Library of Science, which is online, and you can download like SSRN. And he has 53,000 times this particular article has been downloaded. So your 80 citations doesn't actually address the impact that this particular article was having on his field of science. The fact that everybody is downloading this, that everybody was retweeting this, that everyone was saying, oh, you want to know about this? This is the article that you have to read. And what's happening with the legal profession today, with clinicals, with your legal writing classes, with the legal research classes, the things that we are writing about, nobody's going to cite to that. But you will bookmark that. You'll send that and tweet it to somebody else. You'll post it on Facebook and say, hey, here's this really cool thing or this really neat exercise. That's the stuff that we need to be tracking. Those are the things that the faculty need to be part of those conversations. All right. So looking back at scholarly impact, because I just sort of think this is fun, historically with science, you were going for the royals, you wanted that power, you wanted the money, you were part of the conversations. Within the legal field, you can go back, and a lot of times the original discourse was all within letters going back and forth. And there's some really interesting blogs that are talking about how blogging today is what letter writing was before. So if you really want to see that scholarly conversation, take a look at those blogs. Because you have blogs that are responding to each other's blogs now. So you don't want to wait for that law review article that responds, because a lot of times they're not doing that anymore. You want to take a look at those blogs. One other thing that I think is really important is about 2 years ago, the UK, if you want any money, you now have to prove your impact assessment. And what that means is that you have to prove it beyond your school, your academia, and sometimes even your field. How is this affecting the community at large? And so they've really embraced altmetrics because that's how they're showing, here's where we are beyond just what's going on in our campus or going on within our small scholarly community. This is how we're affecting everyone. If you can prove that, you can get the money. And so I really do think, especially the way that our funding is going at a lot of institutions, this is what you're going to see next. And I'm going to talk about a couple of examples with some faculty where publication is being tied to money. But I think that this is what's next. It's not just going to be you get published to get paid. It's going to be you got to prove that people are using this. You need to find those citations. You need to find those other places before we're going to give you that stipend for publishing your paper. Now it really is tenure, tenure, tenure. It's very interesting if tenure will continue. It will probably stay on the same trend, but I do think that you're seeing more and more packets, especially with the scientists adding the badges, using impact story, using some of these, how many times they've been bookmarked on Delicious, those types of things. As you're seeing those more commonly put into these packets, that some of this may change. And it's not just about citation, but really people are looking for tenure. They want that safety. They want the funding. And right now, the way that you're going to do that is through publication. All of these slides are actually available in a PDF. All the links are live because I am going to go to some videos that I'm going to be playing little short clips, but you guys should listen to the whole thing if you're interested in this particular topic. But basically, as you go through the abridged history for the science scholarship, again, you had letters, then you end up, they start publishing, you get your first journal. One thing that I want to highlight from this is actually this ISI, because that's going to be the impact standard factor, and that is something I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But ISI, and this is going to come into play later, ended up being purchased by a vendor in 1992, which is why a lot of scientists have decided, I'm not so sure if that ranking on ISI is something that I really care about anymore. So then basically what ends up happening as you go through the histories, we get to the point, and this is one of the things that I think is really great with science, you get to the research and data can actually start being cited. And so this is something where you're sort of unsung heroes of the science world that were in their labs and they're touching their numbers and they're making their data available. And they know that what they're doing is valuable. Whoever ends up taking that data, or if they write the study themselves and they publish it, they know it's valuable, but nobody else is really taking advantage and using that data because they couldn't get access to it. And now there are a lot of resources where the scientists can actually take their diaries and their journals and everything is available out there. And so now their data is being used in other studies, and they're getting the recognition that they deserve, and they're getting the money that they deserve. So I think the more that we go towards empirical research with our own legal scholarship, if we can make that data available, then we will end up, again, being able to put that scholarly impact out there even more. If we're able to get the data from what we're allowed to provide and put on open source and out there in the web, then it's going to recognize you, it's going to recognize your school, and you're going to be able to get out there even more. So that's another place where I feel like the scientists are doing more than we are, and we need to try to push the envelope as much as we can. Within legal scholarship, so we start back, and one thing that I thought was really interesting is, you know, we all know with legal scholarship, you have your student edited works. Science is different. They are refereed or they have peer edited material, so they've got a little bit of a different spectrum for what is decided to be published and what isn't. But in the very beginning, we actually started that way as well. It was not, you know, back in 1808 to 1870, everything that was published was not student edited. Then you go through, and there were a couple that would show up. 1875, Albany was the first one, but that one only lasted for about a year. Then you have Harvard, 1887. They have their law review. They've got the Blue Book. World War II, you're going to get that rise of all the specialty journals because there was just so many people writing. They wanted to make it available, which is also where we kind of stand today, where every school has a law review or a journal, sometimes 10, 15, it seems like. So when you go from having 5 or 6, and it's really valuable information, how do you filter through that when you now have, you know, 500, 600, 700,000? So it's hard to filter, what do I want to pay attention to? Which is why people are now going to these other sources, respecting their friends who say, hey, I respect you in this field, you need to take a look at this, this one's really great. And then in August 2013, 6 of Duke Law Journal's journals all went online only. And so again, I think that's a trend that I hope people are going. I know it's a slow shift, but I hope more people are going that route. Because then the information's out there, and it will help with ease of people being able to get access to the information. So, scholarly impact is sort of one of these vague things. And actually it was interesting, I was in, I think, was it the Cali session where John was talking about downloads, and he was like, well, who really cares about downloads? Yeah, we're going to make the website end up being able to do that, but is it important? You know, downloads can be skewed. Well, everything can be skewed. Citations are skewed, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think scholarly impact can mean a lot of different things. Traditionally, what it's meant is this basic, it's going to be analytics, but for years and years and years, both in science and in the law, it's this citation count, and that's it. That's really all they're looking at, which is good. I'm not saying get rid of it. But one, there are ways to skew the system. You can game anything, and I don't think it tells the whole story. Sometimes within science and the law, you're getting bibliometrics and webometrics, but not as common for when people are trying to do, you know, their tenure packets or where we're usually working with it. And then for a spectrum for impact, you've got your journal level impact. So that's basically looking at the journal that it's published in. So we're here at Harvard. You get published in Harvard. Yes, that might be higher than Joe Smith's 5th grade law review journal. So you get a little bit of a peak with your citation count because of the fact that you were published in Harvard versus Joe Smith's 5th grade law review journal. Article level impact. So the article itself is within the field being considered at a level where it has a higher level impact, and so again, you get sort of points for that as well. And then the individual researcher, and we seriously all know that there are stars within our field, so it doesn't matter what they write, it is going to be published, it's going to be high level, it's going to be considered high level because of the name that is attached. It doesn't matter where it ends up being published. So that's sort of the standard impact spectrum, and it works the same within science. So why do we care? I've been talking about science. Why do we care about this? Why does it matter? Why do we care that, you know, citations have been working forever? Why do we want to change it? Why do we need to look at that invisible story? Well, one of the big reasons is actually timeliness. It takes, once you publish something, it probably takes about, they say on average, a year before you're going to get your first citation. So you have to wait an entire year. Well, what happens if you are up for tenure before that? But also, you don't know the impact that you're having for that entire year. You're waiting. Who's that first person that's going to cite me? Is it going to be good? Is it going to be bad? I want to know. When are they going to use it? How are they going to use it? Did they even get it? Well, when you use some of these other methods of publication or you do some other things, you get to assess what your impact is within that particular field a little bit earlier. The other thing that I put on here is actually accuracy and citations. And there are two different reasons sort of for that accuracy. One is you can rig it. So what ends up happening is maybe you write an absolutely ridiculous article. Maybe you even write a joke article, which sometimes people do. There's a great one that's about writing law review articles that is just, it's satirical and very entertaining, and a lot of people cite to it. So it may be something like that, or maybe everyone is differentiating your article from them, but it is cited over and over and over and over again. So people aren't saying, oh, this particular work is ridiculous, and that's why everybody's citing it. They just look at the number. So they see you've been cited 300 times. That's what's being put into your packet. It's not saying people are differentiating from me in my opinion because it's absolutely ridiculous. It's just, it's been cited 300 times. So there's an accuracy thing. There's also accuracy, and I don't know how many of you, I'm an avid Chronicle of Higher Ed reader. So there was a really great article that came out about this new gender gap. And so what's happening is this particular professor put together a study, and she was presenting it at a conference where she went through and looked at citations, and men cite themselves over and over and over again. And women do not. And then, in fact, a lot of the women that they talked to said it's icky. You should not cite yourself unless you are the person that is the expert in your field, or you wrote the seminal piece on this and people know you wrote the seminal piece on this. You do not cite yourself. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this article is she talks about how even when she was sort of giving the talk, she knew people would say, oh, well, maybe it's just because that's how it's always been. You know, the citations that she was looking at, the authors that she was looking at, that's how they were raised. It's within the academia. They get into their job, and that's when they're told by, you know, that faculty member that's sitting on the committee next to them, oh, don't worry, just cite yourself. No, there's a grad student that attended this conference that was male and said, It's icky? I would have never thought it's icky. Like, I would cite to myself. So it's actually a gender gap. So that's something, too, that is a new sort of thing I just came across that I think also adds to the argument of why we want to look beyond citation. There are some other reasons why you want to look beyond citation. Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty is really interesting because I've heard it and read it in different contexts. Sleeping Beauty can actually be that sleeper article, and we've all seen it. It's that article that was written maybe 5, 8, 10 years ago, and then all of a sudden it's hot, and everybody is citing it. So even though it was really well written, it had great concepts and ideas, it just wasn't written in the right time. And so all of a sudden, this piece that who knows if this person had already gone up for tenure or that they thought was a stinker ends up being the thing that every single person is talking about. There's also sleeping beauties, like what I showed you earlier with my little teaser, which is if you go by citation count, that guy had 80. If you look at downloads, 43,000. That's really what's going on with that article. So there are some of those sleeping beauties that will always stay sleeping, unfortunately. The invisible college. This is actually a phrase that you'll hear a lot once I start talking about altmetrics, and there's a clip by Jason Prime, who really is the godfather of altmetrics and helped to write the altmetric manifesto, but he talks about the invisible college a lot, and basically what it is this is the conversation that's already taking place. This is what's happening on Twitter. This is what's happening in comments. This is what's happening in your blog. This is when you read that article or you read that Supreme Court opinion, and you feel something about it, and you need to do something with it. Even if it's just sharing it to say, hey, they did something right, hey, they did something wrong, hey, you need to read this, you're sending something via email, you're saving something. That conversation can now be tracked. And that's what we need to do. That's what altmetrics is. So that's that invisible college. That's all that discourse that is currently taking place that nobody's really talking about, but you can track it, and then you can start talking about it. All right, and then finally, gaming the system. Talk a little bit about this, but some of the trends, especially within science, which is really interesting, is they do a lot of pay to publish. So what you're trying to do is get published. If you can get published within a work that has a journal impact factor that's, I think, 5 and above, then you get a certain amount of money. If it's below that, you get a certain amount of money. And so it's really, people are writing for particular journals to get published in particular journals, and it goes beyond the tenure. It's because what they're looking for is that little bit of extra money, especially for a lot of the research scientists. So there's a huge argument that it's actually skewing the way that science is being done. And I think for some people, they would feel the same way about legal, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The other thing is the cite us or else. And I'm very glad to say I haven't heard of this within the legal field. I've only heard it in science. But some of the larger science magazines, and there's been a lot written about it, they will say, your article's great. We really love it. But here's the thing. You need to change at least 4 of your citations so you cite to our journal before we publish it. So then they ensure that their journal impact factor goes up because they're getting more citations. Not only is that happening, but they're actually citing to the authors that were in the journal, which helps their authors that are reoccurringly coming through and getting published within that journal. So if you play the game, it works really well. But what ended up happening was a lot of scientists found out about this, they started publishing about it, and people now have sort of debunked the journal impact factor, although some people still are listening to it. And then finally, this sort of trading up or flipping up, depending on how you look at it. And they do it in science. They're also do it a lot for those of you who are submitting through Espresso or Scholastica, where you basically say, hey, Southern California said that they would publish this article, and I really want to be published in your article. So since they're actually 48 and you're actually 50, maybe you should publish my article, or however you play the game that way. Now, I think that is part of the game. Again, that's one of those where some faculty members say, icky, I'm not going to play that game. There are other people that say, hey, that's part of the system. They do the same thing in science. So that's another place where people say those citation counts, where you're published isn't as important because you basically had to work your way up the system before you weren't picked to be in there. It was something where you kind of bartered and begged your way in sometimes. Journal impact factor too. Eugene Garfield was actually the person who came up with impact factor, and I really love this because he came out a few years ago and actually said that he thought that impact factor likened itself to nuclear energy because it is a force that can help society but can unleash mayhem when it is misused. Because his whole thing was he was a scientist. He liked to read about what was going on within his field, but there were too many works out there. If you remember back to that history, I talked about World War II, what happened with legal scholarship. The same thing happened with scientific scholarship. So there were all of these journals out there, and he basically created a system where he could go through and figure out what he thought were the ones that were worth his time. He created it for himself. Then he shared it with a few other scientists, and now it's this beast that everybody uses. But I think that's great that the person that came up with it is now saying, hey, think about how you're using this. Like all of these sort of metric tools, they can be used for the power of good or evil. But instead of listening to me with what journal impact factor, the Chronicle actually did a really great article about it. And we can listen to their expert talk a little bit about it. If my sound works.
As a scholar, how do you know if the work you're doing is influential? You check to see how often your research has been cited, right? But in the era of social media, is that really enough? I'm Brock Reed. I'm the web editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I'm here today with Jen Howard, a Chronicle reporter, who's just talked with a bunch of folks who say that it's time for a new way to measure scholarly impact. Jen, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me here.
So Jen, let's start by talking about the way that researchers typically keep tabs on this stuff. How do you know that your work's getting out there?
Well, the traditional way of measuring that is what they call the impact factor. And the impact factor measures not an individual researcher's work, but how often a journal is cited by other journals. So we're talking high impact factor journals are examples like Nature. And the assumption is that if you're good enough to publish there, then the work itself must be good.
So what's the problem with this approach? I mean, this seems like it has a nice mix of quantity and quality, like it's kind of good. Why do we need to move past that?
I think the key is it's only kind of good and not very precise. It doesn't really tell you how good the individual researcher's work is. It tells you how good the journal is perceived to be by other people in that field, as measured by how often it's being cited. You also don't know from a citation how other researchers are really using a piece of research. It doesn't really tell you how that individual piece of research is getting out there and interacting with other researchers, other work in the field.
So the folks that you talk...
All right, so that's basically journal impact factor. For somebody else other than me, since I am not a scientist, to explain why journal impact factor is something we need to be wary of. We need to be aware of it, but you can't treat it as gospel. Because again, one of the things with it is that it really is. It's not assessing you. It's not assessing your article. It is assessing what the level of the journal is, and they found all these ways to kind of play with and game with the system, although some of the articles are very interesting. And actually, I think it's very interesting that Jason Prime, again, he's been published in Nature. So, that was sort of the pinnacle. That's when he started getting his claim to fame with his altmetrics, was an article on altmetrics that was published in Nature. So, it's not just for the scientists, though. Some people, it's like, journal impact factor. Okay, that's really great. That's really interesting, but we don't use it. Yes, we do. So, for many of you who have used the Washington Lee University School of Law ranking system, and I've used this for my faculty, I've sat down with them, I've talked to them about it. I do not understand the math of it. I have had that question a lot. But one of the things that you can choose, especially when you're going to do that combined score, is impact factor. Or you can just look at impact factor if you want to do that. So you can get your rankings based on that. So it is something that, yes, we may not talk about it a lot or use it a lot, but it's still there and it's still present in our world, and we are using it to assess sometimes where we want to be published or where our faculty want to be published. So this one's a little text heavy, I'm sorry. You can go back and take a look at it later on your own, but I did want to talk about a couple of them. One of the things on the science side that I think is really interesting, Nature, as we sort of talked about, is one of that is it when it comes to science. You want to get published in Nature. They actually reject half of the submissions before it even goes to the peer editors, because it's just not something that is cool. It's not hip. It's not what they're interested in. It's not just a general overarching. They tend to go less with the specific and more with the general overarching topics, because then they'll get cited more in other people's articles in other journals. So that's a factor as well that's being addressed. So they're also saying that a lot of times, and it was interesting at the end of Paul's presentation, there were a bunch of us that were all talking, and somebody was mentioning there's a article that is in the legal scholarship where it's F-U-C-K, and it's been downloaded 1 billion times. So sometimes the way that you end up putting your title makes it sound really jazzy, and people will download it, and then it skews the information that you're providing. Well, that's also one of the things that they're saying is happening here. If it's jazzy, if it is something that they think that other people will cite to, they're going to publish you. And that's a factor. So they say it is skewing the way that science is going. People are not doing those studies that may be really valuable, but are boring to some other people, except for maybe scientists in their own field. If it doesn't have that wide range, if they're looking for that extra payday, if they want to get published in Nature, they're not doing those studies anymore. They're not taking the time to actually do that science. So here over on the scholarship, on the legal scholar side, I don't know if we're that bad. There's actually a really interesting article by Richard Delgado where he's talking specifically about the civil rights scholarship, and did mention in this first article, I think was published in the late 80s, early 90s, how it's actually 26 male white authors who all exclusively cite to each other. So when you are looking at citation count and determining who the expert is in your field, you need to be aware of that. There is some of this that may be going on. So it's just sort of one of those things to have in the back of your head if you're just relying on those citation counts. Things like publish or perish. I mentioned, pay kind of going along with that publication. I do know of at least 2 schools that have unofficially gone to the, we will give you your money for that stipend to publish, but if you don't publish somewhere, we're not even going to tell you where, you have to publish. If you don't publish somewhere, you got to give us the money back. So I wouldn't be surprised if the next step, again, due to what's going on in universities and funding, it could be you don't get that stipend until after you publish. And then where's a step from there to go to the UK model, which is you publish, we assess what your impact is outside. Are people outside of the law review land interested in your work? If they are, you get your stipend. If they aren't, no. And that's what I think is going to be interesting, because if it does go that far, that's going to really shake up the system. All right, so altmetrics and visible metrics, that is the coin phrase. There's a really great article that actually talks about tracking scholarly impact. I'm not going to go to it, but you guys can take a look at it. It's a blog that talks about why this is really key. Altmetrics is something that I think is really, it's interesting. Jason Prime coined the phrase actually on Twitter, put it out there, and so it's very fitting. And his real main focus, he's involved with a lot of different things. He created Impact Story, which I'll talk about in more detail. If you guys are going to AALL, how I said this is the theory one. If you're going to AALL, I'm actually doing a how-to there. So we'll go more into Impact Story, how to create and bolster your CV using these as a librarian. So this is sort of part 1. Part 2 will be there. So we'll talk more about Impact Story if you guys are going to be at that conference. But for him, Twitter really is it. And so one of the reasons is that he did a study with one of his classmates at Chapel Hill, and over 58,000 scholarly citations go out in a month through Twitter. And so this is what I was saying to a few people earlier when we were chatting, how this is where we need to be. We need to be on Twitter if you're not on Twitter. And I know some people are like, I don't like to tweet. Tweet in a scholarly fashion. You don't have to talk about what your breakfast is. You don't have to take a picture of that cup of coffee or your cat. If you want to, feel free. But you can treat it as scholarly work. The other thing, too, is there was a really great scientist who blogs, and he was talking about why he started blogging. And one of the things that he said that I thought was really interesting is he said, I use Twitter as my resource bank. When I find articles and things that I think are interesting, I just push them out. I tweet them out. And then when I want it later on, I can always go back to it. It's there. It's stored. Now, based on our original, the first keynote speaker, it'll be really interesting to see whatever happens if Twitter goes away. What will all these researchers do? So they don't have a backup. So that's interesting, but I don't think Twitter's going away anytime soon. The other reason why I really like altmetrics is that it allows for things to change. They're not saying, hey, only go and get the metrics from Twitter. only go and get the metrics from Mendeley or Delicious or whatever it is. What they're saying is it can change. You can decide, because right now, it's really important to some artists how many times they're pinned. My sister's an artist, so her Pinterest page is a great thing for her. She'll talk about how many times her work has been repinned. In 10 years, they may not care about that. They may not care about how many times you've been retweeted. They may not care about whether or not you have comments in your blog, because things are going to change. And that's what I like about altmetrics, is it's the idea that you're just tracking the alternative metrics. It doesn't mean that these are the only alternative metrics. So things will change, and the metrics can change with it. I mentioned the altmetrics. People say it is a movement, so of course they have a manifesto. This is one paragraph from the manifesto. If you want to read the entire thing, it is linked here. You can go to the PDF and take a look at it. But again, I mentioned Jason Price, basically kind of the godfather of this within the science realm. He's the one that's been published the most. He and one of his colleagues at Chapel Hill created Impact Story, which is now a company. He actually left his PhD program and is running Impact Story out of Canada. But he gave a talk a couple years ago, and I'm going to let him, again, he's the expert, so let me have him explain to you the value of these altmetrics for a couple minutes.
For those of y'all,
maybe. Everybody stop
this is
tweeting.
my data presentation,
probably
data set presentation. I apologize. There's some stuff that was in there as well.
Oh.
And I couldn't believe I had a whole hour and a half to talk. So
Trying to get you guys to the good stuff.
most important part of what we're doing in science. Because this is where the invisible colleges get created. So DeSalt Price, he talked about the idea of an invisible college, right? You have universities that everybody sees, but the real work happens in these invisible units that are made of your closest collaborators and the sort of, maybe the circle a little bit outside your closest collaborators. You meet each other at conferences, you talk about the latest work, you say this is interesting, this is stupid. That's where scientific progress actually happens, in these conversations. These conversations are extremely important. And increasingly, we have ways of publishing the conversations. We have ways of growing the conversation. So I kind of like him. So I'm pretty active on Twitter, and because a lot of the people in my discipline are, or my, I guess, area of inquiry. And it's like being in a conference with people all the time, every day, right? Which just can be a little exhausting, right? And you tend to ignore some stuff. But it's kind of, you're always seeing this conversation. For me, in my Twitter feed, it's really valuable. It's like I'm always at this conference. So it's kind of cool. So this idea of new tools for conversation, I think about as looking beneath the foliage, right? You can kind of think of, there's this sort of ecosystem of scholarly communication, whatever, maybe I overload that metaphor, but we've been able to see the leaves of the trees, right? It's like we're looking from above. But that's not the soil from which the scholarship springs, right? That's only the end result. That's the end product. We know that research actually springs from the soil of invisible colleges, of conversations with colleagues, right? And increasingly we have ways of making these conversations easier and, I think, crucially more visible. So reference managers like Zotero and Mendeley, a lot of y'all are probably familiar with. Blogs, of course, everybody knows about. Social bookmarking, social networks. These are different ways that facilitate conversations that, again, are not new. They've always been going on, right? But they can be broader, they can be faster, they can be more effective, in the same way that the printing press transformed the communication of research from a letter-based system, right, to this sort of widespread, easy dissemination. I think web tools are transforming the dissemination of the informal, right? The printing press said, here's your formal research story, let's do a better job of that. The web is making your informal research story significantly more effective and significantly more efficient. So a couple examples of that, y'all are probably familiar with Mendeley. Any Mendeley?
So I highly recommend, if you do have an hour and a half, go back, take a look at this if you're interested in this topic at all. It really is a fascinating discussion. He does a pretty extensive question and answer too, so it is all that stuff that as you're watching and you're like, but I wonder about this. It's a room of information science kids, so they're all asking the same questions that we probably would have asked. So it was very interesting. Okay. So some of the things they named, when you're dealing with these invisible metrics, you've got likes, you've got your blogs, you've got how many hits, how many people are taking a look at it, are you being reblogged, are you being reposted, are you being retweeted, you have comments. One thing that's happening a lot within the science realm, which I think is really interesting too, is these, where is it? It's like our nano publications. That's happening a lot within the science realm. And so basically people are taking little tiny bites of it where it's this little section of the study, and that's what's ending up becoming the meat of the particular article. And it's like, we don't really care who wrote it or the rest of what their analysis was, but this one really little tiny piece that they talked about, that's the part that they're citing and that's the part that we care about. And so again, I think we've all read that law review article where you're like, yeah, boring. Wow, that one idea is cool. Somebody else needs to write about this. And then you start following that, and then you realize, oh wait, there really was somebody writing about this, and that's who they were citing from, but they didn't actually cite it correctly because their student editing board didn't do a good job with their sourcing, because we all know that student editing boards, they're all at different levels. So you've got to be aware of what those citations are really indicating to you. But I think, again, these nano publications are a really interesting thing and a place where we can kind of maybe jump in there and do some cool stuff. So we've talked about a lot of sort of disadvantages to the other things. I also feel like I need to throw out that disclaimer. Again, we're not saying, or I'm not saying, this is the end-all be-all. I'm saying use your citation count, use all of your other things that you already do. But take a look at altmetrics too, because this allows you to fill in the story. This adds to the rest of the information. So one of the things that's really great with altmetrics and these types of metrics, and actually Paul spoke a little bit about it yesterday, is that it goes outside the realm of just those scholars or your colleagues or that professor that's down the hallway that will read your article because you're at the same school. It goes out to practitioners, it goes to the clinicians, the educators, the general public. You'll have students. The other thing that's really great, again, when you create, say, your Google Scholar profile, or you put something on SSRN, the really nice thing about that is then somebody can go into Google Scholar themselves, they type in a few keywords, and there's someone who never would have seen that law review article that you published in, say, Albany in 1985, that because some nice librarian or even yourself created an SSRN page for you, made it available, you've got some 18-year-old who's reading your work, potentially citing it, maybe decides to become a lawyer. So it's allowing for your work to get out there in a much larger forum. And then, again, adds to what your impact could be. Openness. I talked about this a little bit, but I really think this is a place where we need to, especially with the real push for a lot of institutions, they want more empirical research work. This is where we can really open the door. This is where we can put that data out there. We can make our research available when we can, when it doesn't violate any other laws. And allow other people to use it. Allow other people to bolster their own anecdotal argument with that data. So I really think we're not doing enough there. And then altmetrics is diverse because it really does go across all the different platforms. It isn't just print. It's looking at articles, data sets, and from the practical side too, I gave this talk actually at Charlotte School of Law, and it just happened that a lot of the people in the audience happened to be the clinicians and the legal writing professors that showed up. So we were talking, I was saying the thing that's really great with altmetrics is this actually allows for you guys to get the recognition that you deserve, because a lot of times the stuff that you're writing, your how to write a better memo, things like that, that's not getting cited a lot. But it is the thing that's being handed out in classrooms. It is the thing that somebody is blogging about. It is the thing that's put on a syllabus that then ends up being uploaded somewhere. So it can be cited, it can be located, it can be found through some of the features like Impact Story. So that's where, again, I think that we're finally, altmetrics allows for recognition of some of the hardest workers in a lot of your schools where they're not getting that citation count. So I think this is really great for that as well. So we already talked a little bit about Steve. Steve was the guy who had the 80 hits and wrote that article and then ended up with 53,000. Again, I love scientists when they ask him about it and they're like, you got 53,000 downloads. He said, yeah, it just happened to hit the right time right now. I was very chill about it. But we were talking about the data, and this is where I think that this is, again, where we can go with this, which is really interesting, is this guy actually, he takes all of his research, and what he researches is actually the effect of shellfish with environmental change. And he takes all of his diaries and all of his studies and everything and makes it available on the web, and now everybody else is taking a look at it. And he's being cited in a lot of other areas of environmental law where now they're suddenly saying, hey, what this guy's doing with shellfish actually can really tell us a lot. And so that's stuff that nobody would have known about before. And so he really is actually impacting outside of his field as well as his scholars that he talks to on a regular basis. So the librarian hat, got to put that one on right now. So altmetrics gathering, here are some of the things that I think we can do. For those of you who work with faculty, who are faculty liaisons, who are going to go back and say, hey, what can we be doing for faculty? You want to make sure that they have profiles, that you can do stat collection on them, that they at least have an SSRN page. If they're not willing to make one themselves, make one for them. Find out what the contracts, though, are. Make sure that you can upload their information. Most of the modern law review and journal contracts will actually recognize SSRN or some electronic format. But if it is some of the older work, some of those contracts actually specifically say you cannot republish in any other media ever. And it also doesn't have that little embargo. So try to track down some contracts so you don't end up in trouble. With Twitter, first off, if you haven't already done this, you want to make sure to check on Twitter accounts for all of your professors. I was at a school where there was a Twitter account that the professor did not know about that existed out there and was tweeting as him. So you just want to check anyway, because some student may have already created one. So you want to make sure that that isn't out there. Then what you can do is you can see actually, are some of our professors tweeting? Do they have accounts? Do we need to give them a basics, or are they good to go? And if they know their stuff, see if they are willing to provide a training to the rest of the faculty. So that it isn't just the librarians coming in or the IT folks coming in and saying, hey, you need to do this. It's other professors saying, hey, you need to do this. Here's how I did this. I'm here to help. Again, if you don't have that, then you can go and try to teach people to do it themselves. If they're not interested in this, this is where I think this invisible college is really important, because I think that the faculty that are not on Twitter or do not have someone monitoring Twitter for them are missing out on the conversation. Because the people that really are having a scholarly impact are. And they're pushing articles. And they're saying, take a look at this kid who's at this school. And they're saying, read this article. And here's what's happening outside of our legal field that we need to take a look at. And so you need to find out from them the list of people that they consider to be the legal scholars that they're interested in, and you go and see if they have Twitter feeds. And you create an account and you follow them on behalf of your professor, or if your professor isn't comfortable with that, you follow them. You create your own account and you follow them, and you kick the information, just like you might do with an SSRN feed that you're given if your faculty member doesn't want to take a look at that. You kick them the data, because right now they're missing a huge part of this conversation. So, librarian hat off. You also need to, if they are publishing, find out if they're willing to flip up, if they're willing to play the game with Espresso and Scholastica, because citation count is still part of it. So if they're willing to play that game, you got to teach them how to do it, because a lot of them don't realize. All right. So great for science, but we're law. We don't care. Here's what's happening, though. Finally, we've got some of the big names are saying, yeah, this is why you need to care about this. This is where everything's going. This is how legal field is changing. This is how legal practice is changing. So you have Susskind who's saying, look, they're doing crowdsourcing legal information as a way of providing legal knowledge. You need to be doing this. You've got Justice Kennedy who says, you know what, we put out opinions. And right away, we have bloggers. We've got people commenting, and it's really insightful. And it's the stuff that we used to get in law reviews and journal articles. That's what we're getting now there. And then you have Sassin who's saying, bloggers are exchanging ideas. This is, the theory there is that this is where letter writing of old, where you had scholars that were responding to each other, that's what's happening in the blogs. All right, so my example. Many of you who were here at Cali last year may remember Jim Mellis actually gave a speech where he talked about law libraries and how they're doomed. But this is a great example, so that's why I use it here. So in February 2014, all I did And I didn't even go to Impact Story. I didn't create a profile for him. I didn't do any of the fancy stuff. All that I did was typed into Google, not even Google Scholar. All I did was type into Google legal education in crisis and why law libraries are doomed. And here's what I got. So I immediately got kicked to his SSRM page, where I found out it hadn't been cited yet, but he already had 609 downloads when it was put up December 20th. Or I'm sorry, December 20th. And then if you look at his other, you can kind of compare. So this is hitting a note. Be it good or bad, this tells a little bit more of the impact. You can go and watch it through Kali, as everyone will be able to watch all of these. And in February, he had presented on this idea and concept last June, and he had 330 views of it. So again, it's not just going to be your citation count or your downloads. It's how many people are viewing that presentation or talk that you gave.
Yes, please do view it.
I got kicked to his Twitter feed where he pushed his work out and other people are talking about it and how he was one of the top 10 downloads, which again, then people who hadn't heard of it yet went, oh, I got to read that article. What's he talking about? And then here, I'm not going to go into it, but this is actually a really good article about I didn't mean to click on that, on higher education and why you should be on Twitter. So if you need some more arguments or if you're on the fence about it, take a look at that article because it's really good. And then I actually went to, I think this was his Facebook page, and it popped up because his Facebook page is public, and the Wall Street Journal had also retweeted his article, and he was getting a whole bunch of hits. So all that was is 2 months after he put it up on SSRN, actually less than 2 months after he put it up on SSRN, and I didn't even put it in quotes. All I did was type in the title into Google, and that's what I got. Now, if we ran an impact story profile on him, I'm sure I would get even more. I get Delicious, I get Mendeley, I get bookmarks, I get every time it had been mentioned in Newswire. But this is this is the basic stuff we could do for faculty that we can do for ourselves. And this tells an impact. Good or bad, this is part of the story. Okay, so this is my recommendation. I did say that I was going to kind of give you a workflow or a timeline. So I recommend this when you're looking at your timeline for assessing scholarly impact. Okay.
Stop plugging.
So your pre-published draft. I know a lot of people are already doing this. You want to put that up on SSRN. Some faculty feel like I'm only going to put that final copy on there, really to truly be part of the conversation. I would say, yes, you want a nice clean draft, but part of it is to also have that dialogue and that conversation. Thank you for the shout out on Stop Plugging. And so you want to make that up there. You want to, and again, if you've got Twitter, if you know people who blog, you want to put that information out there in as many places as you can because you want to start that dialogue. Because the whole idea, and I mean, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it really is just the publisher Paris, that you're only publishing this information because you want to get tenure. But my theory is that I think people want to have conversations about it. I think they're interested in that topic. I think that they want to get feedback on it. I love feedback, good or bad. So by putting that information out there, you're going to start the dialogue. People are going to start talking, and that's how you continue the conversation, and then we can track that. So you want to push it out there as much as you can. After a month is when you want to start checking the blogs, because that's where people might be citing to your work on SSRN. Start tracking those. Then you're going to go through your submission process if you didn't do it earlier because you wanted more of a finalized draft for SSRN. You go through that. If you want, play the game, flip it up the ranks. And then after that, it gets accepted. You want to make sure that your contract, like I said, most of the contracts have been changed now, so they do actually include language that allows you to put it up on SSRN, but there are still some contracts out there that say that you can't. So just be aware of that. Know what your embargoes are. And so you then are recognizing both the school and yourself by putting that information up there. Then you want to repost that link with the announcement that you have been officially published in X, Y, and Z that is coming out in February or March or whatever, spring, summer. And so again, you'll get that next round of people taking a look at your article and continue to talk about it. And one thing that I like with this is actually there was a faculty member who did this, and they were saying how it started a conversation about the value of journals themselves, because she had chosen to be in a specialty journal instead of being published in a higher ranking general journal. And so there's actually a really great discourse that just happened because of that, because when she reposted and mentioned that she was published in this other journal. So I think, again, it keeps that scholarly conversation going. It isn't just to bump up your downloads. The blogs, the trades, the media mentioned. So if you got a good PR communication team at your school, work with them. If it ends up being something that is timely, they can push it out for you. Do some press releases. You can work with the communications department. And then a year out from there is when you should start seeing your true formal citations, where other law reviews and journals are citing to you. So this is what I recommend, that you guys recommend to all your faculty, or if you do it yourself. This is what I think should be the new workflow. And this isn't too much of a change from what we're already doing. But it does mean that you need to be doing getting involved with blogs, knowing to send all your tax stuff to Paul, as he was mentioning yesterday, because it may end up on the tax blog. And then there are tons and tons of official altmetrics and gathering tools. So like I said before, this was more about theory and concept and where you can go with it, and less of the how-to. If you are going to AA, part 2 is going to be there, which is more using these tools to bolster your own personal CV. So now I am opening up for questions, comments, and feedback. And like I said before, I love the discourse. So good, bad, and ugly, give it to me. Yes.
I have a comment that I would like to back up with a small break.
Okay.
I've never been satisfied that SSRN is anything other than a kind of virtualization of the existing academy and its communication pattern. So, I will bet with anyone in this room who cares to take me up on this, $100, that if you look 2 years out, the pattern of download numbers in SSRN for 80% of the entries in SSRN tracks exactly a proportion between the number of print citations and the number of downloads. I'm going to suggest that in 80% of the cases, those things will turn out to be exactly proportional. $100 to anybody who wants to take it on. We can work out the details.
I would say current system, that's probably the case, but if you start doing things like what I recommended here, I think that changes it. Because I think the other thing that you can start doing is like, one of the things that we did at Oklahoma City is we would take our faculty members and we had our own Twitter feed. And so we would highlight a different person's work. And so that does bump up, it changes it, but it bumps up some of those downloads.
And I'm going to suggest that if we follow your recommendations, we can bring SSRN down in 3 years.
Potentially, yeah. But it sounds like you might want that. So, hey, the power. Let's see what happens.
Just add to Tom's comment, SSRN in the law school right now, a lot of law schools have the digital comments, online journals, and a lot of the administrators are already worried that the online journal would take away the numbers from the SSRN. So
there are
that maybe you don't have to do anything; it will come down.
There are actually a couple of librarians that wrote an article about that. And thank you. And so that's something you might want to take a look at. Carol Watson and I.
Well, that was going to be actually my question, because the difference I'm building both. I'm trying to get the faculty to understand what SSRN is for, what you can and cannot put up there, etc. And we're also building our institutional repository and digital commons. So faculty are like, well, if you put it here, it's going to take my download counts away, and vice versa. And all of the scholarship indicates that that's not actually true, because when you put it into Google, you're giving your information to two different sets of individuals. Like SSRN would be, the hits would go back to the people who are looking for that very specific thing because they are putting the very specific thing into Google. Whereas with digital commons, it's full text search, so it's more capable of crawling, and it's going to be giving hits back to a different set of individuals. Anyway, my question was, with what you're suggesting with the workflow is, you're going to have to choose.
No, you can do both. I mean, it's just I didn't include that institutional repository. But you can do the institutional repository and add that in there too. You don't have to choose. Because you can actually take the Santa Clara approach, which is that they've got stuff up on SSRN, they have their own institutional repository, and they keep Santa Clara, they have both, and they keep Santa Clara as it's basically like that first bounce page. So it actually gets people to go to the Santa Clara site, and it doesn't go directly to the library and the repository. So that's something that if you're fighting with or if you have questions from your university about that, you might want to talk to them about how it's actually a way for you to sell the institution, where someone that may not previously have gone and taken a look at your institution's website will actually take a look at it once they realize, oh, this article that I liked that I saw on SSRN that I also got linked to, when I went to the repository, I realized, oh, wait, they are at that school. I'm looking at that school to possibly go to. So it's a way that's an additional PR system for your institution. So you might want to talk to them about that. Yeah.
Are you aware of any deans at any law schools that sort of take this stuff seriously? Because I've spent 20 years kind of trying to figure out the whole faculty incentives thing and how do you move as a faculty to do certain things. And the most powerful thing I've seen is when a dean kind of sort of holds in sort of stuff into sort of an annual performance review or some other way that the deans start to collect sort of data.
Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of any deans that actually take this stuff seriously in any kind of systematic way of sort of collecting information? Like, do any deans work with all libraries to sort of help collect this stuff?
I think that that's a trend of where things are going. I think that there is more interest from deans because, again, they're trying to find ways to sell. It sounds like they may be doing that at Georgia, so I can let Chris. Georgia State, I'm sorry. Georgia State. So Chris wants to speak directly to that, but I can tell you, you hear the rumors and you know about it. I think that the professors are very interested in it, and so again, I think it's something, we all know that at some institutions, once the faculty are excited about something, then the deans potentially will get excited about it as well. I do think at some of the institutions where you do have a librarian that is an associate dean, we can bring it up more in those meetings, and so I know that it's, especially at Charlotte School of Law, they're very aware of it, and they're very aware of the value of it because it is something I bring up in meetings. So I think sometimes it may be the hierarchy of your institution may bring it to the forefront for the deans. But if you would like, Chris, you can come up and speak on the mic and be recorded.
No, it predates me, but it's part of the annual evaluation. The library produces a citation count report, which we send to each faculty member. And our faculty services librarian is the one who oversees this. And the important thing that you have to do, because there's no good method for doing citation counts, and you have to tailor the searches that you're doing according to the faculty member and what subjects they're writing in, and do that. And we're in the process of implementing digital comments, so then we can add, they also add their SSRN downloads, and then they'll start adding their digital comments downloads.
Chris, can you get bulk data out of SSRN for that, or do you have to scrape it?
No, you can get bulk data.
Can you say give me all your all the stats from all my faculty?
A couple of them on there now. I mean, all law schools have to pay for all their faculty members with all of their data listed.
And you can do that from ePress too.
Yes.
Somewhat related point, but not quite in terms of SSRN. One metric that one dean has to report to the provost's office is meetings for faculty. And so that is a very important metric that the provost wants to show impact. And it's so our PR department, we have someone that really puts faculty out there and also tracks that. So that actually, when I see that, I know that they talk about television media, news articles, but I'll probably talk to them about the blog issues because of whether or not that is going to be added to that kind of metric.
And then the other thing,
something helpful.
And the other thing too is with Impact Story, which again I didn't go into a lot of detail, but one of the things that they actually go through and they scrub and they pull data is actually the media. So that is something